Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about why early churches in England are located near to water, and more specifically, often in loops of rivers and at one-time limits of navigation. Now, the background to this is early 2011. I'd recently moved to the middle of Wiltshire after many years in North Leicestershire. I'd come across academic accounts of the earliest churches in both Wiltshire and Leicestershire, so I thought it would be fun to compare and contrast the differences between Wiltshire, in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, and Leicestershire, in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia. Right, plot spoiler. There's almost no difference, as both are inland counties with relatively small rivers. The real difference turns out to be with large rivers, such as the Thames, and with early churches on the coast. But in all cases, it's all about the water, or more specifically, about waterborne trade. The period I'm talking about is the 7th and 8th centuries. The Augustinian mission of 596 had led to the progressive conversion of England starting from Kent and the southeast, and at the same time the initial Irish conversion of what's now Wales and Scotland had led to further missionary activity in the west and north of what is now England, and eventually things met up in the Midlands. One thing was missing from most of England at that time. That was anything we would recognise as a town or urban centre. Yeah, there were a few ports, mostly in the south, which regularly traded with the continent. But the people there were, well, itinerant traders, not townspeople. Towns do start to appear, specifically in the Midlands, so in Mercia but not Wessex. So think of Derby, Nottingham, Leicester, Tamworth, Stamford, they're the best examples. And then we have Scandinavian settlements on the coast, but they don't start till about the 10th century. But back in the 7th century, all this was a long ways in the future. Now, the very first stage of conversion generally created an abbey or a cathedral, and I suppose by the very nature of these settlements they steadily evolved into small market towns and later into modern cities. But after the abbeys and cathedrals, the next stage was to create so-called Minsters, each responsible for about a dozen or so parishes. Okay, parishes were still a few centuries in the future, but same sort of area of land. Historians spell Minsters with a Y, to distinguish from later Minsters, which, well, operate differently. So the Minsters I'm talking about provided a base from which the clergy looked after the spiritual needs of the people living in the area of land that they looked after. Now, that unit of land was sometimes called a pays, but I'm going to use the term parochia because, although it's slightly anachronistic, it is the term that's used later. Now, almost certainly these land units were not invented to fit around the newfangled Minsters. Instead, they probably had more or less the same boundaries as Roman and maybe Iron Age landholdings. And that means that Minsters were likely to be close to where a former administrative centre or posh house and villa once stood. Now, one thing we know about the early church, it was big on bling. And wine and incense for liturgical purposes, exquisite fabrics and needlework for vestments and altar cloths and such like. The church also imported medicinal herbs in a big way from the eastern Mediterranean, and, well, frankly, a whole range of what at the time would be regarded as, well, serious luxury items. So, we can say that the Holy Roman Empire was as much about trade as it was about piety, because all that bling had to be paid for and sourced by someone. Logically enough, the bling was paid for by selling some of the parochia's farm produce, perhaps grain, but more likely livestock. On the continent at that time, England was famed for horses and hunting dogs. So, well, de facto, Minsters were centres of trade. So they needed to be on trade routes, and that meant waterborne trade routes. I think, to be honest, the Holy Roman Empire was concerned that a country as wealthy as England wasn't buying enough goods from the continent, or the trade that went beyond Constantinople, along the Silk Roads into India and China. The Empire's, imperial agenda aimed to establish as many colonial trading posts in England as possible. Now, if this sounds like some devious precursor to either European colonialism a millennia later, or the European Economic Community and its successor, the EU, in post-war recent times, then you'd be right. But let's not go there. Suffice to say that the Roman religious occupation proved to be more successful than the previous military occupation. In more recent centuries, the idea of Christian conversion has revolved around notions of saving souls. But excuse me, such notions were still several centuries in the future at the time of the Augustinian mission and generation or several after that. I mean, the idea of saving souls is mostly a post-Reformation notion. Until recent decades, British history was mostly written by rather pious C of E types with little awareness of how anachronistic their religious presumptions were for anything before about the 12th century. So, with Anglo-Saxon Christianity, please forget the back projections of modern piety. Instead, simply follow the money, which of course will quickly take you all the way to Rome. Whatever the initial political and economic agendas, by the end of the 8th century, Minsters had turned out to be a really good idea. One of the advantages was that there was a literate priest who could read and reply to correspondence from the king and his tax collectors and so forth. The same cleric cum clerk, and the words cleric and clerk are cognate, spent his spare time teaching literacy to at least some of the sons of the nobility, not least the ones who would in turn take clerical orders. The English kings had quickly realised the advantages of this and gave what we would now call tax breaks to any landowner with a minster on his land. Hey-ho, no wonder minsters propped up in profusion. And indeed, as with all tax breaks, this arrangement led to those with the most money taking advantage. Now, it has to be said that by the end of the 8th century, minsters were regarded as a good thing. So, little surprise that more and more minsters were created in the 9th and 10th centuries. And by then there were so many they were competing with each other, and steadily the arrangement gave way to private chapels in the later 10th century and into the 11th century, and it was these chapels, along with most but not all the earlier minsters, which evolved into the arrangement of parish churches which persists, well, until now. The problem for historians is that almost all surviving records are from the 10th to 12th centuries, or later, so trying to identify the earlier minsters from these records is rather tricky. But some devious thinking helps. For example, one of the best clues is to identify which churches distribute chrism oil each year to, well, shall we call them daughter churches. I'll spare you the details as to why, but it was one of those customs that never needed to change, so must have started with the oldest church. So the surviving documentary records are rather few and far between, and to read them requires, well, very well-honed paleographical and linguistic skills. Now, I'm anything but that sort of historian. However, David Parsons published a thorough study of the Leicestershire evidence, and J.M.A. Pitt did the same for Wiltshire. I subsequently discovered the studies of the Chichester area, the Sussex coast, and Radnorshire. And because of all this prior scholarship, I was able to investigate these 5 regions in sufficient detail. Suffice to say that without the work of these scholars, then my own researches would not have been possible. What all these studies reveal is that the earliest minsters were located in a good location for waterborne transport, and usually with a good connection to existing roads. Why aren't they simply located at former Roman regional centres, the civitas, such as Leicester and Lincoln? Well, firstly, such places were most likely to be where the very first abbeys and cathedrals were located, rather than merely a minster. But there was an additional problem. The Romans created civitas near the then limits of navigation of inland waterways. The problem is that over the next 300 years, the soil runoff generated by the Roman heavy ploughs began to silt up these rivers. So, by the end of the Roman era, trading places downstream needed to be established. In Leicestershire, what is now Barrow-on-Soar, where an east-west Roman road crosses the River Soar, seems to have taken over from Leicester. It helped that just a few miles to the east along this road it crosses the Fosse Way, which runs north from Leicester towards Newark and Lincoln. Fosse Way, of course, also runs south down to Cirencester and then the Dorset coast. The Romans found other solutions too. Uniquely at Lincoln, they got round the problem by creating a canal. The end result of this process is that in Leicestershire and Wiltshire, an early minster was created near the then limits of navigation along every river. Just the one minster for each river, and yet one minster for every river. OK, there are some complications. Along the main rivers, such as the Soar in Leicestershire and the Wylye in Wiltshire, early minsters also appeared at the side along the more downstream parts of the rivers. But these were usually near confluence with small tributaries, but not always. Now, some of you watching this video will be aware of the work of the eminent Anglo-Saxonist John Blair, and you'll be going, "No, Bob, you're wrong, all the early minsters are at confluences." Well, excuse me, but John Blair started out by taking a close interest in the Thames Valley, where indeed the early minsters are closely associated with confluences. But the Thames isn't a typical English river. It's a lot bigger. And it's not even typical of bigger English rivers, as it's less prone to sudden flooding. If you look at the locations of early minsters along the Trent, an equally big river, they are mostly not at the confluences, simply because the confluences of the Trent with, say, the Dove or the Erewash or the Soar are the places that were most likely to be inundated when heavy rainfall up on the Staffordshire moorlands caused the upper reaches of the Trent to send vast amounts of water downstream. So, the notion that early minsters are associated with confluences is true for the Thames, and for the River Wye in Radnorshire, although the confluences there are with decidedly minor streams. But for lesser rivers in inland counties such as Leicestershire and Wiltshire, the association with confluences is nothing like as common. And it's not true for the south coast either. Any number of early minsters were founded in the area of Sussex around Chichester, itself an early cathedral, and these were founded at places where flat-bottomed coastal trading vessels could be easily beached for loading and unloading. As the historian Philip Masters described, Bosham, Selsey and West Thorney had direct access to the sea. West Wittering, Warbleton and Pagham were all on tidal inlets, and Aldingbourne and North Mundham were adjacent to rifes which had almost certainly been tidal. The last one, North Mundham, was on what would have been a substantial river until the diversion of the River Lavant. Now, just in case it's not obvious, all the places that Philip Masters names are the locations of early minsters. Same is true along the coast at Beddingham, which is to the south of Lewes, where an early minster was created where the coast road could ford the River Ouse. The coast road, now the A27, has a bridge over the river now. As the River Ouse has a massive tidal range, the minster was created at the confluence with the Glyndebourne, so vessels could beach in comparative safety away from massive tidal rip. There's some amount of continuity going on here, because Beddingham is overlooked by Mount Caburn, which was originally an important prehistoric gathering place. However, after Lewes Priory was founded around 1078, Beddingham's importance declined. Now, if you want further confirmation that the people selecting locations for early minsters were looking for places best suited for waterborne trade, then note that many of them are in loops of rivers. Well, what's this got to do with waterborne transport? A lot. Water flows faster around the outside of such loops and slower on the inside. This means that sediment builds up on the inside of the loop. Apart from anything else, this creates shallow beaches where flat-bottomed craft can be landed. The Anglo-Saxons had a specific name for such loops. It was the word ham. Historians spell this with two M's and an E at the end to distinguish from the homophone ham, which is the origin of the phrase homestead. So place names ending in ham are usually from the ham cognate with homestead. But sometimes, as in Evesham, the origin is with the sense of land projecting into a river. Evesham, the name, originates as the Harm, surrounded by the River Avon, belonging to Eof. This minster was founded by St Egwin in the early 8th century. Durham Cathedral is famously on a cliff top with the River Wear almost encircling it, although here the ham ending is from a different source. It's the Scandinavian holm. Another example is Confluences in Radnorshire. The church there sits in a loop of the river. This photograph was taken from the steep footpath, which still forms the only land access. I mentioned Barrow-on-Soar taking over from Leicester, and before late 18th century changes to the river course, this too was within a massive ham, a massive loop. Interestingly, the word barrow here is not from a burial mound, but from the Old English barrow, meaning a sacred grove. Now, in a future video, I'll go into much more detail as to why these loops of rivers seem to have been pre-conversion sacred places, and why actually the same reasons would have given a sense of the numinous to the early minsters too. And, whether or not in a loop of a river, early minsters near the limits of navigation are at places where the river could have been easily forded. The two go together, as fords need riverbanks on both sides to have gentle gradients, and such gentle slopes are ideal for beaching flat-bottom rivercraft. Good example, the early minster at Luffenham in Rutland, which is on the confluence of the River Foss with the Chater. The church at what is now South Luffenham is surprisingly close to the banks of the River Foss. For those of you seeking evidence of continuity of administrative centres, then note that the very high-status Roman villa has recently been discovered about a mile downstream along the Chater. I mentioned this in the earlier upstream and downstream video. Another early minster was created in the upper reaches of the Deverell Valley in Wiltshire. Although the watercourse now shares its name with the lower reaches, so is shown on maps as the Wylye. On the face of things, Monkton Deverell might be assumed to be the site of the original minster, but this seems to take its name from quite later monastic activities, and the more probable location for the earliest church is at Kingston Deverell, where the church is adjacent to two modern bridges, but at a location suited to a ford. Indeed, there is still a ford a short way downstream. The presence of a prehistoric burial mound to the immediate west of the church implies, or does not prove, continuity of significance. And if you think I'm over-egging the economic importance of early minsters, then just think what happened to them in the following centuries. A reasonable proportion effectively faded away, either entirely or survived as the parish church of a sleepy out-the-way village. But the majority evolved into market towns. The locations proved to be ideal for trade, at least until canals and then railways changed transport radically. Think of Warminster, Leominster, Axminster, Kidderminster, Sturminster, and even Westminster. And that's just the minsters that gave their name to modern towns. Most of them didn't. Part of this evolution of minsters into market towns is preserved in our language. In Wessex, more so than in Mercia, the early minsters were surrounded by a defensive earthwork. The Old English name for such defences was burh. So we get a whole load of Wiltshire minsters in places with bury at the end of the name. Alderbury, Amesbury, Avebury, Heytesbury, Malmesbury, Ramsbury, Tisbury, Westbury, and probably Yatesbury. As centuries roll on, and Bury becomes borough, and we get new market towns being planted, such as Marlborough, a couple of Narboroughs, Market Harborough, which have borough at the end, because that's the word that denotes a market town. Clearly the original sense of defensive earthworks has long since been forgotten. And, furthermore, what was the name for the posher people who lived in these newfangled boroughs? They were burghers, a corruption of the same word, borough. In the description below, I'll include a link for a much more detailed PDF, which gives a lot more evidence for the ideas I've tried to summarise in this video. It also has a substantial bibliography, giving details of all the previous studies I've mentioned.